Do you think she is now in a more dangerous position because of what we're seeing happening in Iran?
I think that there's a lot of instability now inside Iran itself. You've seen the anger spilling over from some of those demonstrations yesterday. People think that their international reputation has been damaged by the government trying to cover up the tragedy of the shooting down of the plane. I think we've been seeing really since about last November some of that tension beginning to bubble up internally. And I think that, as Mr. Ratcliffe said, you've got a regime that really doesn't think twice about holding individuals as bargaining chips.
How do you think the UK government should be responding? We've heard a lot about de-escalation, but of course things stepped up with the arrest of the UK ambassador.
Well, of course, that was indicative of a regime whose instincts are to repress and cover up. But at the same time, they're having to deal with the realities of international law. It's illegal to arrest a diplomat. And of course, with the investigation ongoing about the crash, it was impossible to cover up there. So you've got these two things going on at the same time. I just hope that what we have at the moment gives a moment for both sides to think the best way forward for everybody is to get back into some sort of negotiated settlement. But the Prime Minister and the Foreign Secretary are right to say we need to de-escalate. We've got to find a diplomatic way through all of this, because the alternative would be further loss of human life.
Do you think Donald Trump is making the world a safer or more dangerous place?
Well, the President of the United States has a responsibility to protect his own people. And America is able to, and has a right to, respond in self-defence. And the point I was making the other day was, that General Soleimani carried out a lot of these things, the proxy wars in the Yemen, the support of the Assad regime, support of Hezbollah, who themselves support the international drug trade, while he was part of this regime. And this is a dangerous position. If on top of that there was an imminent risk to American military personnel or diplomats, the US has a right to respond to that.
The other debate, of course, when you're talking there about Iran and their instinct to cover things up, do you think it's credible that Iran are claiming that they simply mistook this aircraft, this passenger jet carrying 176 people, for a missile? Is that credible?
I think it's always possible to have human error. If you remember with the very unfortunate tragic shooting down of the Iranian aircraft by the American military, again, that was a human error rather than policy. So I think we have to accept that that is a possibility and try to move on from there.
OK. And then we were talking to Brandon Lewis earlier on the show, the Security Minister, who was talking about the importance of the Iranian nuclear deal. Do you think that the UK government just needs to accept that it's over, it's not happening?
Well, I've said this in public and I've said it in the House of Commons. I think that when the US withdrew from that deal, it was dead. Some people say it was still on the table. Believe me, I've spent enough time as a doctor to know that just because you're on the table doesn't mean you're going to get off successfully. I think that we need to look at a wider deal. Remember, before the Iranian nuclear deal, the Iranians wanted what they called the grand bargain, that looked at wider issues, regional issues. And I think that we have to get back to that. I think that the Iranian nuclear deal was rushed, partly because the Americans wanted it done before the end of the Obama presidency. I think we need now to look at the wider picture, what's happening in the region with Iran, what's happening with the other Gulf allies that we have there, what's happening with Israel. How do we get a wider and more regional settlement?
OK, now I want to talk about the speech that you're giving this week. It's all about global Britain. Can you just explain what it is you're going to be talking about? Well,
it's first of two speeches, really. The first is, and this one is about how we organise Whitehall and how we organise the civil service. I think it's a real opportunity for us, with a new role for Britain outside the EU and with new functions, including trade, in a world that's changing very rapidly, to look at how we organise Whitehall and our structures of government, and also the role of the civil service post-Brexit, and see whether they need to be changed. My own view is that we need to be looking at countries like France and Sweden as examples of where you can get some political appointees in the civil service to enable the government to put forward its agenda and carry forward its agenda more quickly and more certainly.
Do you think part of the issue with the civil service is that many people there were opposed to Brexit? It's an argument you made before.
Well, I think that there was an institutional resistance. Of course, it's impossible for any of us to know how much of that was an inherent resistance in the civil service and how much they were being egged on by some of my former colleagues who didn't want Brexit to happen either. But nonetheless, it's very clear, I think, that even when you look at other Westminster-based systems like Canada or Australia, those governments tend to have more influence in the implementation of policy than we do in the UK.
You also want to see the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development merged. Is there not a risk then that the aid budget is effectively used for political purposes?
You know, how the aid budget is used is set out in a number of agreements and, of course, in our own legislation. But what I think it would do is I think it would give us a chance to have a single foreign policy, because if you go to Africa, for example, you'll find that they have a bit more interest in talking to DFID than they have the Foreign Office, because DFID has the money. I think bringing them two together makes a lot of sense, could be synergistic. And also, if you are represented by two cabinet ministers instead of one, you get a counterbalance to the Treasury, which might not be a bad thing in Whitehall.
Two for the price of one. Now, of course, you used to be the International Trade Secretary. Boris Johnson says he wants to have a full trade deal signed off with the EU by the end of the year. Is that achievable, really? It's
achievable. The questions are not going to lie around issues of tariffs or quotas, which you would normally get in a trade negotiation. That's normally what takes up a lot of time. It will really be around the regulatory issues. It'll be about access to the single market. What's clear is that we will be outside the single market, therefore you can't have what's called frictionless trade. There will be some friction in that, and the government have set out they want to minimise that, but they want Britain to be able to determine our regulations. Therefore, the concept of what's called dynamic alignment, i.e. we automatically follow EU rules, is out the window, as it should be, because it's incompatible with Brexit itself.
Now, of course, you have previously served in cabinet with Boris Johnson. You didn't back him as leader of the Conservative Party. Have you changed your mind on him now you've seen him as Prime Minister?
Well, I think that what he's done is to deliver for the Conservative Party in a way that some people doubted. A huge majority for us, which has given us a moment in politics, a little bit like Mrs Thatcher's win in 1979. Well, I think I, like many people, underestimated the sheer power he would have in attracting voters. And we now have an opportunity to make the Conservative case with voters, particularly in the north of England, in a way that we've not been able to do, not even in those Thatcher years. And I think that that is a tremendously important moment in our politics, and for the Conservative Party, something that we haven't had in more than a generation. So it's up to us to make sure that we take full advantage of that.